Jumping back into reading part 8. There we go. All right. Autobiography of Malcolm X. I must be honest. Negroes, Afro Americans showed no inclination to rush to the United Nations and demand justice for themselves here in America. I really had known in advance that they wouldn't. The American white man has so thoroughly brainwashed the black man to see himself as only a domestic civil rights problem that it will probably take longer than I live before the Negro sees that the struggle of the American black man is international. And I had known, too, that Negroes would not rush to follow me into the Orthodox Islam which had given me the insight and perspective to see that the black men and white men truly could be brothers. America's Negroes, especially older Negroes, are too indelibly soaked in Christianity's double standard of oppression. So, in the public invited meetings which I began holding each Sunday afternoon or evening in Harlem's well known Abduban Ballroom, as I addressed predominantly non Muslim Negro audiences, I did not immediately attempt to press the Islamic religion, but instead to embrace all who sat before me, not Muslim, nor Christian, Catholic, nor Protestant, Baptist, nor Methodist, Democrat, nor Republican, Mason, nor Elk. I mean the black people of America and the black people all over this earth, because it is this collective mass of black people that we have been deprived not only of our civil rights, but even of our human rights, the right to human dignity. On the streets after my speeches, in the faces and the voices of the people, I met even those who would pump my hands and want my autograph. I would feel the wait and see attitude. I would feel and I understood their uncertainty about where I stood. Since the Civil War's freedom, the black man has gone down so many fruitless paths. His leaders very largely had failed him. The religion of Christianity had failed him. The black man was scarred. He was cautious, he was apprehensive. I understood it better now than I had before. In the holy world, away from America's race problem, was the first time I ever had been able to think clearly about the basic divisions of white people in America and how their attitudes and their motives related to and affected Negroes. In my 39 years on this earth, the holy city of Mecca had been the first time I had ever stood before the creator of all and felt like a complete human being. In that piece of the holy world, in fact, the very night I have mentioned, when I lay awake surrounded by snoring brother pilgrims, my mind took me back to personal memories I would have thought were gone forever, as far back even as when I was just a little boy, 8 or 9 years old. Out behind our house, out in the country from Lansing, Michigan, there was an old grassy Hector's Hill, we called it, which may still be there. I remember there in the holy world how I used to lie on the top of Hector's Hill and look up at the sky, at the clouds moving over me, and daydream all kinds of things. And then, in a funny contrast of recollections, I remembered how years later, when I was in prison, I used to lie on my cell bunk. This would be especially when I was in solitary, what we convicts call the hole, and I would picture myself talking to large crowds. I don't have any idea which I don't have any idea why such provisions came to me, but they did. To tell that to anyone then would have sounded crazy. Even I didn't have myself the slightest inkling. In Mecca, too, I had played back for myself the 12 years I had spent with Elijah Muhammad as if it were a motion picture. I guess it would be impossible for anyone ever to realize fully how complete was my belief in Elijah Muhammad. I believed in him not only as a leader in the ordinary human sense, but also I believed in him as a divine leader. I believed he had no human weaknesses or faults, and that, therefore, he could make no mistakes, and that he could do no wrong. There, on a holy world hilltop, I realized how very dangerous it is for people to hold any human being in such esteem, especially to consider anyone some sort of divinely guided and protected person. Hmm. My thinking had been opened up wide in Mecca. In the long letters I wrote to friends, I tried to convey to them my new insights into the American black man's struggle and his problems, as well as the depths of my search for truth and justice. I have had enough of someone else's propaganda. I had written to these friends, I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is, for or against. I'm a human being, first and foremost, and as much as I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole. Largely, the American white man's press refused to convey that I was now attempting to teach Negroes a new direction. With the 1964 long hot summer steadily producing new incidents, I was constantly accused of stirring up Negroes. Every time I had another radio or television microphone at my mouth when I was asked about stirring up Negroes or inciting violence, I'd get hot. It takes no one to stir up the sociological dynamite that stems from the unemployment, bad housing, and inferior education already in the ghettos. This explosively criminal condition has existed for so long it needs no fuse. It fuses itself. It spontaneously combusts from within itself. They called me the angriest Negro in America. I wouldn't deny that charge. I spoke exactly as I felt. I believe in anger. The Bible says there is a time for anger. They called me a teacher, a fomenter of violence. I would say point blank, that is a lie. I'm not for wanton violence. I'm for justice. Pause there. Jumping back into Frederick Douglass. Douglass made a careful study of the range of overseers he had known, from the sadistic to the reluctant to those who enacted violence as mere policy in the slave system. His master, Anthony, seemed to be the company man enforcing policy except when sexually scorned. Then he joined the darker side. A James Hopkins seemed as good as any man can be, and still be an overseer. He whipped slaves with open discomfort. But under Anthony's general command were two other overseers, William Sevier, pronounced Severe, and Orson Gore. Douglass mistakenly identifies him as Austin Gore. These were these were not names invented by a novelist, but real. Hardin paid accessories to slavery's crime on the Y plantation, WYE. One day near the slave One day near the slave quarters, Frederick heard noise and screaming. As he sauntered over to the scene, he witnessed Nellie Kellum, a tall, strong slave woman, being wrestled and dragged toward a tree by Sevier. Nellie gave as good as she got in this fight, clawing Sevier's face with her nails and hitting him as hard as he hit her. According to Douglass, three of Nellie's five children witnessed this bloody fracas. As Sevier finally subdued Nellie and roped her to a tree, as the children screamed, Let my mommy go. Sevier shouted foul curses and, like a savage bulldog, beat Nellie to a bloody pulp, while the woman took the blows with fierce and indignant courage. As Douglas wrote of this event years later, he implied that the worst part of him was not Nellie's back covered with blood, but her screams mingled with those of the children. Such was young Frederick's prolonged initiation into the world of human relationships, to notions of fairness and morality, of crime and punishment, of familial bonds and fissures. Overseers were the law enforcers and the courts. Nellie's offense that led to her bloody beating in front of her traumatized children was the ubiquitous slave crime of impudence. The moral Douglas, the abolitionist, drew from the story was that Nellie, as Veer scarred, I'm sorry, the abolitionist drew from the story was that Nellie, a woman, had stood her ground as long as she could. She left the ugly Sevier scarred in his already deformed face. Her bravery, something Douglas would later claim for himself, proved the doctrine he invoked with excessive bravado. He is whipped oftenest who is whipped easiest. He is whipped oftenest who is whipped easiest. The staring statement, while manly and inspiring, has the air of smugness offered from a safer position as author of his memoir many years after watching the slaves on the Y estate live with the frightening daily grind of comprehending just who could muster such courage to resist and who could not. He could hardly offer us, or himself, any sense of what the bleeding Nellie told her sickened children that evening in the quarters. Fighting back was noble and possible, but Douglas also left a distinct impression that in the daily experience of Eastern Shore slavery, even a child began to understand that sanity itself, as well as physical survival, might be at stake. Douglas' litany of experiences with violence went even further. Douglas's litany of experiences with violence went even further. He analyzed the overseers as a distinct class of Southern society. Gore served as the prototype of the cold and calculated tyrant who could instill fear in slaves. He operated not with disgusting swagger and noisy bravado, but with grave and calm self-possession. Gore worked by reputation and action. His power was absolute, and his method intimidation. He never allowed the slave even to answer back to his orders. Gore worked by the maxim, said Douglas, that is better that a dozen slaves suffer under the lash without fault than that the master or overseer should seem to have been wrong in the presence of the slave. Gore's words were few but shrill, and the result was sensations of terror among the slaves. I shunned him, wrote Douglas, as I would have shunned a rattlesnake. He was still young enough to get away with such avoidance in Douglas's portrayal. Gore seemed destined for his calling, the perfect creation of slavery itself, the ideal chief of a band of pirates. Gore seemed the perfect colonel in slavery's sick-minded, evil army patrolling the police state. A 20-year-old robust slave named Bill Denby got into a scrap with Gore. In Douglas's telling of the episode, after a few lashes, Denby ran and plunged into a creek with the water up to his neck. Gore stood on the bank with a shotgun on his shoulder. He gave Denby to a count of 3 to come out of the water. The belligerent, heroic young man refused, and Gore shot him at point-blank range in the face. Although Douglas admittedly did not witness this killing, he heard about it all over the quarters and wrote about it in dramatic terms. In an instant, poor Denby was numbered with the dead. His mangled body sank out of sight, and only his warm red blood marked the place where he had stood. Gore apparently made his case for a necessary killing to Colonel Lloyd, who gave his approval. No judicial inquiry occurred. Douglas used his case to show that the murder of slaves in Maryland not only remained legal and went unpunished, but that it stood as the terrifying symbol of a society of immoral lawlessness. At the heart of Douglas's autobiographies was the idea that slavery attempted to crush all semblance of natural rights for its victims. A society that sanctioned cold-blooded murder and fostered homicidal madness as necessary steps to social order could only be called by its names: piracy and tyranny. Douglas' later prolific appeals to the natural rights tradition and even to the right of revolution should be first considered in light of these compelling, damaging childhood memories of such cruelty. I have to pause there on that one. That's a lot to process right there. Back into Justice Blind. Reducing crime. Police, courts, and corrections are obviously aimed at reducing crime, or crime fighting as some like to call it. This can be achieved through reactive means after the crime occurs, or proactive means before the crime occurs. The former type of crime fighting is generally called crime control, whereas the latter is often referred to as crime prevention. Amazingly, the U.S. Constitution does not list crime control as a responsibility of the U.S. government. Therefore, the U.S. Congress was not explicitly empowered with this authority. The Constitution does state, however, that our government must establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, and this mistake, and this makes crime control an implied power of government. Because crime control activities are not specifically granted to the federal government, and because they are not specifically denied to the states, crime control has historically been responsible of state governments. Since the 1960s, however, crime control has become increasingly a national issue as a consequence of the politicization of crime in elections and media coverage of crime. In the United States, crime reduction is mostly reactive in nature. For example, American policing has historically been aimed at reaching to calls for service from crime victims after the crime occurs. Our agencies of criminal justice try to apprehend, prosecute, convict, and punish offenders after a crime is discovered by or reported to the police. It is important to point out here that reactive criminal justice operations are not likely to reduce crime because they do not eliminate the root causes of crime. This is why the National Criminal Justice Commission claims we cannot expect the criminal justice system to create strong families, deliver jobs, or provide hope to young people because it is not charged with doing so. In fact, because the criminal justice network does little to address the major sources of criminal behavior, crime prevention through criminal justice is not likely. Crime prevention includes any means to eliminate the causes of crime so that crime does not occur and does not need to be dealt with by criminal justice agencies. Although some American criminal justice activity is aimed at crime prevention, the great bulk of it can be described as crime control. There is some evidence that crime prevention can be effective if appropriately designed, implemented, and supported. Reducing crime is obviously a desirable goal, but the most important point to remember while reading this book is that there is another, more important goal of our criminal justice network: doing justice. Although reducing crime is an important goal, it is of secondary importance to doing justice. Doing justice. First and foremost, the basis of the criminal justice system is doing justice. There are two somewhat conflicting conceptions of justice, and one concerned with holding the guilty accountable for their crimes, and the other with ensuring that the criminal justice process is fair and impartial. Doing justice implies both that guilty people will be punished for their wrongful acts and that innocent persons will not wrongly be subjected to the criminal justice process, which is the more important conception of justice. Which is the more important conception of justice? Question mark. If you had to choose to emphasize one conception of justice over the other, which would you choose? What is justice? Question mark. The meaning of justice depends on who is being asked. To crime victims, justice may simply mean getting even with the offenders who harmed them. For example, a rape victim may define justice for the attacker as imprisonment or even castration or death, and might perceive anything less as unjust. When people are intentionally victimized and the guilty are not held accountable for their actions, justice clearly has not been obtained. This is because the offender has unfairly gained an advantage over the victim. The mythical scales of justice shown in Figure 1 through 2 have wrongfully been titled in favor of the offender. The scales of justice depicted in the figure are in balance only when the harm inflicted on crime victims are righted by administering punishment to their offenders. Retribution, a main reason for administering criminal sanctions to offenders, implies that the harm inflicted by the criminal upon the victim will in some way be returned by the government to the offender. In the United States, when a criminal hurts someone, he or she is viewed as deserving of punishment, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, so to speak. Victims now regularly view punishment of their offenders as one of their rights. This is one conception of justice. Justice has an alternative meaning as well. In some ways, this definition is related to the one above, for it is concerned with assuring that the scales of justice are not imbalanced. This conception of justice is based on fairness and impartiality. I'll show you these scales that they're talking about here. It assumes that all persons will be treated equally in the eyes of the law, that justice will be blind. Pause there. All right, readings for writers. Check back up there. When drafts are not working, I encourage the students to start again and encourage them to try it until something clicks. We pay serious attention to all the works that's written seriously. We use one another's writing, mine as well as theirs, to demonstrate whatever lessons about leads, titles, editing, for example, we need to learn. During the second half of the course, we studied the relationship between personal experience and more objective research based academic writing. In the latter form, two, the problem is believability, but for the objective writing, the resources are external to the writer. Now they depend on libraries, interviews, and site visits to create credibility, whereas before they relied upon their own experience. As students write and revise, they learn to shape and reshape meaning in both their personal and their academic lives. In the act of seemingly endless revision, usually without precedent in their secondary school experience, students begin to transform their understanding of knowledge from something fixed and rigid to something fluid and relative. By the end of the term, they have revised their way to new interpretations interpretations of their own experience. They have refocused and reshaped their research project several times, making it difficult for them to continue to see things as black or white, right or wrong. No, in quotations in parentheses. No, what you say here isn't wrong, but what if you approached it this way next time? Question mark, parentheses, in quotations. At the end of the term, the students had in portfolios containing all of their written work. They received one grade on a combination of process, amount of seriousness, revision, and risk taking, and product completeness, neatness, correctness, and coherence of the final draft. The opportunity in freshman English then is to help students learn to write in their own voices about a variety of issues for different audiences and to help one another along the way. Not all of them succeed completely, of course, but they are all well started. When they do succeed, they have become mature and independent writers, and they have become mature and independent thinkers as well, members of the academic community at last. Dispassionately, autonomously, ar- arbitrary, debilitating. I definitely have to look up all those words. Dispassionately, autonomously, autonomously, arbitrary, debilitating, and bibliographic, bibliographic. Tilly Warnock is an associate professor at the University of Wyoming. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California and is, is the author of Writing is Critical Action. Do writing teachers practice what they preach? That intriguing question formed the basis of the book Writers on Writing, from which the article comes. The author, who was once the director of Writing Center at the University of Wyoming, candidly admits that much of what she preaches about writing she does not practice. She also shares with us many of the techniques she has taught to and learned from her students to encourage their growth as writers. One could one cold July night several years ago at Vidal during the Wyoming conference on freshman and sophomore English, several people were talking beside the fire when one man began explaining how exhausted he was from revising his textbook. We asked how he writes. He described his writing process in detail, but seemed particularly pleased with the stage when he passes his draft to his wife, who was not in English, so that she can detect the BS in his work. Because I was delighted by his account, I asked if he included such collaboration as a common stage for writers in his textbook. He drew himself to full height, a large shadow against the flames and silhouettes of mysteriously shaped mountains, and replied indignantly, Every word I write is my own. The conversation ended. I want to admit right away that no words I write are my own, and that I never write alone. I also want to confess that I spent many years of my life with the golden dream of having a book de- dedicated to me, not of writing one, but of inspiring one. I wanted to be the I wanted to be the power behind the throne, or in the words of Ernest Hemingway, to be that most essential gift for a good writer, a built-in shock-proof shit detector. A built-in shock-proof shit detector. I did not want to take risks myself. I wanted to be the one without whom not. At a certain point, I began to want not the upper hand, but the writing hand to be my own. Instead of motivating someone else to write, I wanted to relax in an important sense of that word which I will try to develop later and write for myself. With this change in attitude toward myself and toward writing, I began scrounging around to find words to help me write and to see myself as a writer. I'll stop there. Jump back into a game called Salisbury. One was Henry Edward Cohen Bryant, but they called him Red Buck, his red hair having something to do with it. Eventually celebrated as one of the bright lights of the Caldwell era, Bryant came to the Observer right after graduating from the University of North Carolina, offering to work for nothing until Caldwell thought he was worth something, which didn't take long at all. He got the job after his first major assignment, an enthusiastic coverage of the white supremacist campaign rally in New Bern, North Carolina. It was a lot like a Ku Klux Klan rally, except with red shirted in place of white caped marchers, and the added touch of white women adorned with white robes and garlands, riding on floats. Bryant was, after all, still a kid, and he got caught up in all of the hoopla that his writing would continue to reflect. A few years after Bryant signed on, Caldwell lost one of his brightest stars, Isaac Irwin Avery. Avery was widely acclaimed as the best newspaper writer in the state, until one day in 1904, when he was found dead in his room, one floor above the Observer office. It was suicide. Caldwell was crushed by Avery's loss, which soon sent him looking for someone similar to fill his shoes. Looking for someone, and it wasn't long before Bryant, on Caldwell's behalf, found a suitable replacement in the poet and lawyer John Charles McNeil. He tracked McNeil down in his Laurinburg law office, surrounded by his squirrels, possums, and raccoons, and offered him a job, without desk or deadline, to write whenever and whatever he wished. McNeil had a poet's ear as well as a reporter's eye, and his verse caught the sounds of creeks and crickets, horses and hounds, and the soft sibilance of Negro dialect. After accepting Bryant's offer, McNeil would continue to write poetry as he worked as a reporter for the Observer, and his talent did not go unnoticed. For his songs Merry and Sad, he received the Patterson Cup of the Best Contribution to Literature in the state and an award presented to him in 1905 President Theodore Roosevelt. With McNeil, Booth, Bryant, and Klutz Jr., Caldwell had a writing team that put most others to shame, at least as far as the Lily story was concerned. His dream team wouldn't last long. All four would be gone within the next 2 years. But in 1906, Caldwell was on a roll. Even one of his weaknesses had worked to the Observer's advantage in the end. Though his drinking ran off a valuable editor, his resistance to the Prohibition movement contributed to his falling out with another North Carolina editor. and that was a good thing. Josephus Daniels, editor and owner of the Raleigh News and Observer, was a notoriously racist demagogue. His paper, boasting the largest circulation of any paper in the state, was the fourth major source of news on the Lilly case. Besides reports by Bryant, McNeil, and Julian, it might have been the most influential, though less factual, of all. Daniels' reporters did not identify themselves, but they didn't have to. Daniels' hand was in everything they wrote, and after 1898, and everything written by other Democratic papers in the state, with one clear exception, the Charlotte Observer. Daniels lost his control over Caldwell and the Observer completely, just as few years before 1906, when the two clashed over the endorsement of William Jennings Bryan as the national Democratic candidate. When Caldwell refused to favor Bryan's candidacy, Daniels pushed Caldwell too far, though still siding with the white supremacist sympathies of Daniels and other Dixiecrats. Caldwell, by 1906, was no longer Daniels' pal or his puppet. The rift over Bryan's endorsement had been the last of several straws that turned the Observer in a somewhat independent direction. This development, along with the survival of several Republican papers, served to blur the stark black and whiteness of the Lilly story into something more like a softer gray.